Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here, actually my first time in Utah, so beautiful state, thank you. Today I'm here to talk to you about best practices, and I've been talking about this for a really long time. The motivation for giving this talk is that my husband and I co-wrote PHP and MySQL web development, and we gave our first PHP best practices talk in 2001, right? And you know, we're having kind of a little bit of an old home week, pulling out all of the slides and laughing hysterically at them. Because I'll tell you one thing, there's something that dates as badly as old code, as old slides. This is kind of a retrospective of all of those things and what we've learned and what's changed and what hasn't. So I hope it's fun for you. And it has funny pictures if you think I'm boring, so that's okay. Okay. So the general overview of the session is I'm going to start by talking about defining what I mean by the term best practice. People always want to talk about best practices, right? Like it's the thing I get hammered about constantly. Like what is the best way to do this? The general topic areas that seem to have come up in these talks that I've given over the years over and over again are how should I architect my PHP app? How should I make it secure? How should I make it scale? And how should I work, right? Like what should my process be like? And then at the end I'm going to try and answer this question that if you are a reader of Hacker News or other technology sites, you may have heard this kind of rumor that PHP itself is not a best practice. So I'm going to address that. Okay. So just in terms of the format of these slides, if you see a slide that has a back header, it is a vintage slide. I have adapted it. So anything on it, if you choose to use that as a best practice, you're taking your life in your hands. And again, reading your old own slides is like reading your old own code. And I'm going to take each of these topics through the years from 2001 to 2014. So let's start by talking about best practices. Okay, so this is a vintage slide. Best is a strong word, and this is an opening slide from a best practice talk from many years ago, from 2001. And YMMV, which is your mileage may vary. And I actually really prefer the term good practices. I am so all about the grey areas. Anyone that's ever worked with me will know they say, should I do A or B? And I'll say, well, had you thought about doing both of them? Or is there something you can do involve the best elements of both? And best practices are a little bit like this, right? There are some things that are clearly better than some other things, but it's very, very, very context dependent, right? I'm never going to say that is a terrible way to do something because there may be a reason that it was the best way for you. There are, however, some guidelines. So let's talk about guidelines. Vintage slide from 2004, I think. Your PHP should be simple. It should get the job done. It should be secure. It should be scalable and performant, which are two different things. It should be fast to produce and easy to maintain, which those things tend to pull against each other. Okay, so I think not a lot about that has changed. And now let's talk about kind of the architectural subtopic. I love this picture. This is fantastic. Anyway. This is a very old slide. This is from 2001. When you are architecting an app, the first thing you should do is the simplest thing that could possibly work. I think this is actually still a pretty good rule. I think kind of the thing to think about when you are doing the simplest thing that could possibly work is that may not be the thing that you want to do second, right? But it's a good place to start. First thing in architecting an app is you want to think about separation of concerns. So in 2001, the advice we were giving people was like, you can use include files. Like you can take your header and put an include file and include it at every page. And we gave the advice that, you know, you should try to like not mix your PHP and HTML together because that makes the code a little bit harder to read. Don't know about using like reuse templates in an include file, although it's kind of like the basis of every framework. But the idea of avoiding mixing your PHP and HTML is still a good idea. 2004, you're saying to people, why are you still mixing your PHP and HTML together? And really by 2008, not much had actually changed. These days, I feel like we're getting a little bit better about this. And part of that is to do with frameworks, which I'll talk about a little later in the presentation. But I really feel like we're finally starting to get some traction here. It is far from universal. If you do any consulting work, you will know that I speak the truth. Okay, so frameworks. This is such a great slide because it's like from 2004, before I realized that a wall of text was not the best way to build a slide. So this was about the time that Rails appeared on the scene. I think this is about when Ruby on Rails was about a year old. And everyone was like, oh, this is the new thing, and it is shiny, and I shall use it for everything. And at this stage, there were a million PHP frameworks. My husband Luke says that the average PHP developer has written 2.4 frameworks. And so in general, this is this old slide. We said MVC is kind of a good thing, but everybody has different ideas about how it ought to be implemented, and some of those ideas are really strange, and it tends to bloat your code, which is still true in a lot of cases. And which people would always say, which is the best framework for me to use? And back then, really, the answer was none of them, because they all kind of sucked. The only thing on this slide I think that's still interesting is that bottom point, right? Have a simple architecture that's easy to add to, easy to explain to the new developer on your team, and easy to understand if you come back and look at the code in 5 years' time, right? Because when you are writing maintainable code, you're writing it for yourself. You're not writing it for the guy that might take the project over from you or some new person that you hire in your team. You're writing for yourself when you have to come and fix some bug that you created 5 years later. So remember that. Okay, so in 2001, we didn't know what a framework was. In terms of PHP, they had not yet been invented. Strange thought. In 2004, all frameworks suck. I'm pretty famous for saying this. Yeah, I've been quoted as saying this. In fact, like Cal Evans wrote a book and the first line of it is all frameworks suck, quoting me, which is kind of embarrassing. He made me write the preface. In 2007, they still sucked, but I sort of said framework shaming was starting to decline. So if you said, I've written my code using Cake PHP, I wouldn't go, ha ha ha, but it was kind of okay. And then, like, these days, the thing I'm really excited about, actually, and I think that if you've been doing PHP for a while, you'll probably have the same feeling that I have, that there is kind of a renaissance in PHP happening in the last, like, 12 or 18 months. And part of that is some of the new frameworks, the frameworks that are built to work with PHP 5.4 and upwards. They're just, we actually learned something, right? Like, as a community, we matured, we learned how to do things better, and we have these nice, lightweight frameworks that don't bloat your code as much. They don't kill performance, they're easy to learn, they have good documentation. And that's a really good thing. The other thing is that frameworks are starting to standardize, right? So if you've used one and you need to move to another one, it's not this horrifying jump. You're starting to be able to share components between frameworks, and that's a revolution, right? For a long time, if you were using one framework, then you had to use a set of, the date component and the form component that went with that framework. And if you're using another framework, then you have to learn all of those skills all over again. With the ability to use different components across different frameworks, suddenly your skills are more transferable, and that's a huge plus. Okay, so what I think are framework best practices today, I personally have a really strong bias towards lightweight frameworks against heavyweight frameworks, right? And again, because all best practices are different in different contexts, sometimes heavyweight ones are better. In general, I think heavyweight frameworks are great if you have a really simple CRUD app, because they'll get you 90% of the way there. They are great if you have really junior developers and you want to kind of like show them and have a really good structure of like how things are done so that they can learn from that. And if you have huge teams, heavyweight frameworks can be the right thing because it's just a method of communicating between your large team. ORM, I really dislike it. It's a great Kickstarter. It will help you get V1 of your app out the door, but it's like training wheels. At some point, you're probably going to want to throw it away. So I think the main takeaway from frameworks is use what works, and when it stops working for you, throw away that part of the framework and write it yourself, and you will end up doing this. Okay. More than the sum of its parts. Okay. So back in 2001, I was saying the best part of a good architecture is decomposition and decoupling, and this is still true. Back in 2001, the approach to decomposition was to write functions, and this was revolutionary. There were 100,000-line PHP apps that did not include a single function. Cut and pasted code is not your friend. And people thought they were being really revolutionary by putting code in an include file. By 2004, we were like, we will use OO, and it will be bad, but we will use it anyway. By 2007, everyone was making a library, and everything had an API all of a sudden. And this actually, I think, is a really big revolution. Once you start thinking in terms of kind of API-driven development, it tends to make your code a lot cleaner. And as you move towards this kind of more API and component-driven architecture, if you can think about what the interface is to your stuff, then the way you implement your stuff doesn't really matter. If you've gotten the interface to it correct, you can change the way you implement it 17 times. It doesn't matter. If you mess the API up, you're really in a bad place. So in 2014, one of the other things I think is really revolutionary here is that we now have actually like solid dependency injection and package management tools, which was, I think, a weak point for the PHP community for a long time. I will not say that this is better in other places. Over the last couple of years, I've been writing a lot of Python, and that if you want to think about sort of package management hell, you should think about Python. Okay, nice language. Package is awful. So, robustness and resilience, which are also kind of two different things. This is a very unrobust architecture for a car. Okay, so in 2001, we were talking about best practices for a robust PHP app. We said, you should write some tests. And we were very good about saying it and not very good about actually doing it, right? And I don't think anybody really knew what they were doing, right? You write kind of a script that tested some code or something, but by 2004, test-driven development had been invented, and that's kind of remarkable. There are people sitting in the front row who could talk your ear off about test-driven development. I'm not going to. I think Chris will later in the weekend. By 2004, we're starting to think about this idea of resilience more too, right? So if a service that I want to use is down, then I would like my overall app to be up. So I'm going to cache the output of that service. So that's things like caching to disk and caching to memcache. The idea of a resilient system is as much of it should be able to break as possible and the whole thing should still work. Think of the internet as a resilient system. You also should think about defensive coding by 2004, right? Like you were thinking, I'm getting data in and out from these different components and I shouldn't trust it. I should always test what I get back, even if it's from my own code, because I don't trust myself. By 2007, we were thinking about high availability of apps. We were thinking about like failing over through multiple data stores, which was complicated, especially if you're using some frameworks that didn't support the idea of having multiple data stores. And by this stage, we're all kind of doing like trying to do multi-master databases, and that's enough to make you want to drive off a cliff. Okay, 2014. So the development of this in terms of scalable, resilient architectures is you want to minimize and isolate your failure effects. The idea you want is a self-healing system. So if component A of your system fails, let's say you have your PHP wrap running in 2 different Amazon clusters, and let's say that one of the zones falls off the map, right? You want your app to keep running, and when those machines come back, you want it to keep running, and it's like you don't have to do anything. So everything should work as much as possible. And the idea that the other thing that's sort of made its way into our architectures now is feature flagging. So let's say that you get featured on some tech news site and you have millions and millions of users rushing to your app. You can selectively choose what's going to not work, right? You might say, these are the parts of my app that are really important. I want people to be able to sign up for an account. I want people to be able to buy stuff. Nothing else matters. All of the other stuff, we can flick switches and turn it off so that we can focus all of our load capacity on this one thing. Okay, that's kind of the architectural section. Moving on to security. This is really a fun thing to talk about in terms of the history of PHP security best practices. A very old slide. So back in 2001, think about what people might do illegitimately with your application. Educate yourself, read stuff, look at examples, and if nothing else, filter all external data. Don't try and go to that URL, it's long dead. It is a vintage slide. This was a project that a few people, some of whom are probably in this room, worked on, which was like an initial cut at how can we write more secure web apps. Okay, this is a very long slide, so it's kind of interesting. This is from 2004. External data is not to be trusted. So what's external data? Anything from a form, GET, POST, request, cookies, server name, database query results, web service data, files on disk, filter everything coming in, escape everything going out, use whitelisting for input, and escape stuff according to where it's going. It's a very dense slide. What's interesting about this slide is most of it is still pretty much true. Not much has changed. If there's anything on this slide that you don't know what I'm talking about, come and see me afterwards. Okay. Okay, so again, 2004, what were the common attacks we were seeing? Problems with register globals, cross-site scripting, SQL or command injection, any kind of injections generally speaking. One thing we worried about back then, you don't really see so much now, is like people messing up their Apache configs and exposing source code. Session fixation, session hijacking, cross-site request forgeries, which are new and terrifying at that time. And then, actually, this might be 2006 slide because cross-domain Ajax was a little later. So, okay, so what's different between then and now? Register globals is dead, magic quotes is dead, the slides have less words on them, and surprisingly little else. So if you got your security education in how to write a PHP app in around 2006, you don't have a lot of new stuff to learn. There's little bits. There's always like new things and new attacks and little things and upgrades, but you have a pretty solid foundation to build on, right? That's really interesting to me because I feel like for a period there, like there was a new attack every week and everybody was freaking out, and it's kind of like hit a cap where the set of known attacks on PHP apps is like this. And I think part of the reason for that, and part of the reason that researchers don't have to push very hard on this, is people still do a really bad job. There's a huge number of like insecure web apps. I mean, just like, speaking as someone who runs an old version of WordPress on their blog and had it hacked like a couple of weeks ago. So, you know, We're lazy, right? I'm lazy, and it's easy to make mistakes. Okay, so web app security. In 2001, we were saying you should use SSL. That's still true. You should not store credit card numbers. In fact, this is actually kind of interesting. I don't know if you guys are following the Target attacks, but one of the things of saying don't store credit card numbers anywhere on disk is that they only have them in memory. So the Target retail attack, where they stole a whole bunch of credit card numbers, is an in-memory attack. They grab the card number from the memory, but because it's never written on disk. Interesting, new class of attack. We escaped output naively in 2001, but we didn't know we were naive. Fortunately, the attackers were pretty naive back then as well. And this is back in the good old days when we used to say you should use add slashes when you're writing stuff into a database, and this is kind of hilarious. If you don't know what that is, it's okay, you don't need to know. By 2004, we were all filter input and escape output and avoid cross-site scripting. And I just have to mention MySQL real escape string versus MySQL escape string. If you don't know what it is, doesn't matter. Just move along. Nothing to see here. We know better now. Okay, by 2008, we had kind of got this idea of like cross-site request forgeries figured out. We were passing around tokens to work around that. And one of the big things that happened around this time period was most people stopped like putting user variables in their SQL statements, and they started actually using prepared statements or parameterized queries. If you are not doing that, and I'm sure there are people in the room that are not, this is the #1 thing you can do to improve the security of a web app today, I think. And the other thing that happened in 2008 was ORM, which also took care of a lot, like sort of protected people from their own mistakes, right? Like because it's sort of, it's like using somebody else's encryption library. You have wrapped up a lot of the solutions in one place. Okay, by 2014, most people are using frameworks. That helps you protect you from your own ignorance. And it also means that new developers are learning like a good way first, which is nice. Scalability, I'm gonna have to talk faster. And performance. So these are slides from 2006. It's like the summary of a presentation that I gave, like the 15 points. And what's really interesting to me about the slide is it's from 2006, and what's that word on the second line of the slide? DevOps cooperation is essential. DevOps was not a thing until like 2010. It's interesting. But we still thought it was important back then. So profile early, profile often, test on real data, track and trend, draw graphs. Any assumptions that you make are going to come back and bite you. You should always measure. In terms of scalability, there are a few basic things you should do, and pretty much all of these are still true. Decouple, cache, federate, replicate. Put minimum amount of load on things that don't scale well, and make sure that whatever you do in production, like if you have a master and slave database, you should have that in your development or staging environment as well. Otherwise, you will find a unique class of bugs that you can't reproduce locally. Okay, third slide from that presentation. Use a compiler cache. Be careful of using external data sources because they're always the slowest thing, like ads or whatever. Avoid recursion, heavy looping code. Don't try and outsmart PHP. If you look at some of the micro-optimizations articles that people write, they'll tell you like 1,000 things you can do to make your PHP run faster, and most of them won't, actually, and some of them will actually make it run slower. And whatever you build it with caching in mind. So that's interesting. 2006 slides. There is nothing in those slides that I wouldn't tell you to do now. Pretty much all of it is 100% still the same. This is an interesting thing. That looks like something that's parked in my driveway. Okay. I'm not kidding. We have a killdozer at my farm. So, performance. So in 2001, we were telling people, use ASAPI. Don't use CGI for PHP, because then like your web server will be forking off a new process. And now people are like, what's CGI? And you should tune your SQL queries, like use indexes. By 2004, we were like caching everything. We would have like a query cache, a disk cache, mem cache. We had like multiple layers of caching. And of course, the downside of this was when you were trying to find a bug, you had no idea like where to start looking. Anyway, by 2007, stand back, I'm going to use science, because we had figured out that the best way to make code faster was to measure it. So measure, track, tend, profile, optimize. Know when you commit a change, what impact that has on the performance of your code. Build cacheable code and decouple reads from writes. Write in one place, read from somewhere else. Replication of data, federation of data, sharding, right? By 2014, it's a refinement of the stuff we're talking about 2007. I think the big difference between 2007 and 2014 is message queues, right? We got really good at decoupling reads with caching long before we got good at decoupling writes. So decoupling reads cache, decoupling writes queue. It's just like a basic architectural principle. One of the things that's changed is this idea of using the right data store for the job, right? Sometimes it will be a SQL relational data store, and sometimes it will be a NoSQL data store. And people kind of tend to, if they haven't done much with NoSQL, will lump them all together. It's important to know that every single one of those choices makes different trade-offs, and you need to know what they are before you can make a decision. The other big thing in 2014 in terms of performance is DevOps. So hopefully if you're a developer, you have a great relationship with the ops people, and you work together to make stuff scale. Okay, coding practices. This is probably my favorite picture. It takes a minute sometimes to figure out what that guy's actually doing. Anyway, okay, so this is old. Above all, your code should be readable and maintainable. Beware clever code, and I still think this, and I will tell you right now that I am the person that doesn't like closures. You know, there's a time and place, but a lot of the times when you see somebody use a closure in PHP, all they have done is made the code harder to read. Just a comment. So avoid that cool design pattern, the obscure performance tweak where someone's looking at the code and like, why? Weird niche language features. This is an old slide. Turn error reporting up in development. Turn display errors off in production. I really hope you're doing this. Set top level error handlers and exception handlers so that anything that you haven't caught somewhere else gets caught at the top. This is really good for legacy code too if you just want to kind of like just have something. And do not do what I still see people do, which is where you open this file of code. It's 400 lines long and it says try at the top. That's not going to solve your problems. Okay. Back in whenever I wrote this, 2004, I think, have a user coding standard. I wouldn't tell anyone to use the pair coding standard anymore, but I did then. And legacy code always sucks, and that's still true. Through the ages, in 2001 we said, you should write comments. You should make your code reusable. By 2004, have a coding standard and use OO, because we were convinced then that it was going to be like the bright, shiny thing that saved us all, but it took a little bit longer. In 2008, we were all like, yes, we will make PHP look exactly like Java, as much as humanly possible, and then maybe people will take us seriously. We started with namespaces, and that's when we got iterators, which was kind of a nice thing too. By 2014, there are so many shiny things that have landed in PHP in the last couple of years. Generators and anonymous functions and traits. Oh my. I sort of made this joke, it's been to look like Christmas, actually Ruby. So we went from trying to write PHP that looks like Java to trying to write PHP that looks like Ruby. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I leave that in your hands. But we have all these great tools now. We have Composer, we have PHP Unit, we have PHP Doc, we have Doctrine. We actually have tools to make our code good, which is nice. In the old days, it was just you and Vi, not even Vim, probably. Anyway, software process. So this was revolutionary. When I put this slide up, I had a lot of people disagree with me. In 2001, web development is software development. It was very page-oriented development then. Web pages were documents, right? And people thought that they could write them in Word or in front page. It wasn't thought about as software development. I could say, who here is not using a version control system? And I cannot see a single hand. I can tell you, I said that, use version control at like DC PHP in 2008, and half the audience was not using version control. And I will say, thank you to our sponsors. But seriously, I think one of the best things that GitHub has done for people is it has commoditized version control. There is no longer any excuse not to, right? Okay, have a test process, have a release process that is documented, have an easy way for developers to set up a staging server and plan for scale. Okay, this is all really old stuff, but it was revolutionary at the time. Through the ages, in 2001, if you had a process, it meant you wrote code on your own machine and then FTP'd it to production. If you didn't have a process, it meant you were writing code on the production web server. Put up your hand if you have done this. Good, that makes me feel better. All right, put up your hand if you still do it. Good. Damn you, all right. By 2004, hopefully you had a staging server, and we were so excited to be deploying because you could SSH into production and type SVN up. When we shipped Firefox 3 at Mozilla, we had a thing called Download Day, which is where marketing came to us and said, we have announced this initiative where we're going to encourage as many people to download Firefox 3 on the day it comes out as possible. So we're going to drive all that traffic to our website on day one, and we're going to set a Guinness World Record. And we're all like, oh no. And back in those days, we deployed with SVN up. And you knew because somebody had edited the configs on a production web server, and we had a conflict. Probably one of the worst moments of my professional career, but that's okay. 2007, we had test-driven development. We had instrumentable code, right? Stuff where it was actually designed to be measured. You had a process that you could repeat, right? Like you knew roughly how hard and how long it was going to take you to ship a release. This is around when Agile became a big thing. Like it had been around for a while before that, but this is about when it kind of got snowballed. And I say that Agile was the death of estimation. My comment on Agile is it's when we said estimation is hard. Let's just say this is how much we can get done in the next 2 weeks, because most of us can kind of think 2 weeks out. But how long will it take me to build an elephant? Still almost impossible to answer. If you ask me how long it takes to paint the elephant toenails, I can say, yeah, I can probably get that done in 2 weeks. Okay. By 2014, we had better tools for everything. We're all about the continuous integration and deployment. We have test automation, woohoo, and monitoring, and test automation and monitoring have converged, right? So you're probably running some tests against your production server, as long as they're not destructive. Version control became commoditized, and we got this new idea of like the measurement for reliability of your app was the mean time to recover from a problem instead of the mean time between failures, and that's a pretty revolutionary thought too. Okay, so the final section. If you read Hacker News, you know, I do it and then like I self-flagellate and I read Hacker News and they're very similar. It's just very sad. Anyway, you will people that tell you that only idiots use PHP, and if you use PHP, you must be an idiot. PHP itself is an anti-pattern. What is it? A fractal of bad design. Or I said the pinnacle of bad design here. All of us here are incompetent. All right, so let's have like a Incompetence Anonymous, and we can all kind of... It's been 3 hours since I wrote my last line of PHP. And PHP is only really suitable for making trivial personal sites. And you can still find people saying this, especially if you hang out on Hacker News, Stack Overflow, anywhere there are a lot of Java developers, Ruby developers that like their lips start to twitch because it's kind of curling up and they can't help it. Okay, so let me take you through the history of this. In 2001, people were telling me, PHP is a toy language. You should write your important web app in Perl, Cold Fusion, or ASP. Interesting. Classic ASP, which wasn't classic then because it was the only kind, like when Classic Coke was the only Coke. All right. 2004, PHP is no good for the enterprise. You should use ASP.NET, JSP, or J something. It didn't actually matter what came after the J as long as it was J in front of it. By 2007, PHP doesn't have a single awesome framework. It has lots of terrible frameworks, so you should just use Ruby on Rails. By 2014, we go to Hacker News. PHP is for losers. And really, I made a crack on Twitter the other day about, like, I use programming languages that haven't been invented yet, which is a reference to, like, some joke about bands. I listen to bands that haven't been invented yet. These are hipster languages. There's nothing wrong with them. They're all good languages, and they're all good for certain things. But that doesn't mean that PHP sucks. Okay. So my general comment about this is, over the last 14 years, one thing that time has told me is that PHP is like 80% of the internet, and it works. And people have been telling us that we're stupid for like 14 years. That's okay. PHP coders are just going to write code. And these are all things that are written in PHP in larger or smaller extent. And there's some ones missing off there that I found out about recently too. Like I keep finding more and more new cool companies that are using PHP. So like Box uses PHP, Lyft uses PHP. So there are actually like Valley startups that hang out in Hacker News that are written in PHP, but they will never tell you. Anyway, so that's it. If you have any questions, you can email me or send me a tweet or grab me at lunch. It was a pleasure to come and speak to you. Thank you.